First up is Inside Out 2, which is a sequel to the 2015 animated film from Pixar, and I am someone who holds the first film in such high regard. I think it might be amongst my favorite films of all time. Animated, live action, doesn't matter. The way that it communicated and demonstrated emotions and the way it gave everyone a sort of vocabulary to be able to talk about it and also captured a nuance and was just super clever and fun and heartbreaking. It's just a really brilliant film. So when Pixar said, hey, we're making a sequel, I went, oh boy, this is a choice. Now, I didn't say this is the worst idea ever, and generally speaking, Pixar has kind of a mixed track record when it comes to sequels. Everybody has a mixed track record when it comes to sequels, right? But Pixar in general, I think, also suffers from this thing where they have set the standards for their own films so high that they are victims of their own success often, right? So when you already have that going for you, and then you pick one of your greatest films in your stable of films, and you're like, we're going to make a sequel, I'm like, ooh, the expectations. It's hard not to have them. And so going into this film, I went in open-minded. I will also acknowledge I have not watched the original in a little bit of time just because I cry a lot during it, and I don't necessarily want to do that right now. So Inside Out 2, it is 9 years after the original film came out, but 2 years later in the life of Riley, who is still our protagonist. And I will note, you don't actually have to have seen the first one in a while to kind of get it. They do a pretty decent job of just sort of setting things up and condensing, and that is applicable to audiences, I would say, of all ages. I was sat next to my friend's 7-year-old, and I asked her beforehand who her favorite emotion was, and she couldn't remember pretty much anything about the first film. So I said, okay, great, no problem. And I will not spoil this, but, she had a great time at it, so I will get that part out of the way already. Now, it's 2 years later, so Riley, our protagonist, is about to hit puberty, and along with puberty comes a new set of more complex emotions, and if you've seen the trailers, you know that we're getting anxiety, envy, ennui, which is such an obscure emotion to pick, but I kind of love that they went with that, and then also embarrassment. Now, the original voice cast mostly returns. There are a couple of changes. Amy Poehler still returns as Joy, Phyllis Smith returns as Sadness, and Lewis Black as Anger. Disgust and Fear have been replaced for this one. Tony Hale is now Fear, Lisa Lapira is Disgust. I may have noticed a slight difference in their performances, but it might be because I'm just hypersensitive to this type of thing. And then Ayo Edebiri is Envy, Maya Hawke is Anxiety, Paul Walter Hauser is Embarrassment, and Adele Exarchopoulos is Ennui. So, Riley, going through puberty, I experienced so much just transitive and secondhand anxiety and embarrassment on the character's behalf. So in that sense, this film is very, very successful. The whole film takes place over Riley goes to this hockey summer camp, and she's there with some high school girls, but also her old friends from childhood, and she's trying to decide which kind of gang she wants to fit in with. And I think it's a theme that, everybody who's gone through puberty will kind of understand, wanting to feel more grown up, but also just loving the joyful and innocent nature of being a kid with your besties from forever ago. So it's very successful in capturing that stuff. But I think the film makes things a little overcomplicated. It introduces this idea of values, and if you remember from the first one, we have memories, which make up kind of who she is, and then in this one, the memories inform her core values, which is a cool concept, but it just gets a little complicated here. And it's not that I didn't understand it, but I was like, is this advancing the story in a way that makes me connect to it emotionally? Am I invested, et cetera, et cetera? I think in terms of mechanics, it might be a little much. The majority of the film centers around, these new emotions and the old emotions kind of duking it out for who knows best for Riley. And, like I said, I think it was slightly overly complicated. And while it builds on the framework that the original one set out with how the mind works and these, islands that make up her personality and all this sort of stuff, it didn't feel like it improved upon it. It just wasn't as complex and sophisticated as its predecessor, which, it's really hard to do because Inside Out was such an original idea that when you go, you know what, we're going to make a sequel, what do you have to offer here? And I don't think it adds in a meaningful way. I don't think it necessarily detracts from it. But again, as someone who just loves the first one so much, I was like, oh, okay, this is fine. I think there are still plenty of clever things that are more like guffaw laughs, and there are a couple hard laughs I had in there, but aside from that, I just didn't feel maybe as emotionally invested in it. I think some of that comes from envy and anxiety being the two newest characters that they really focus on. I think they did a pretty good job of capturing the feeling of anxiety. One of the things that I was thinking about is, anxiety is obviously an emotion we feel, but it is also kind of a disorder that many of us have dealt with, and so it would have been interesting to me if they had introduced it as that versus a core emotion that everyone has to deal with. And then there were also parts of this movie that felt I don't know, I don't want to say pessimistic, but it did not feel, and not that every movie, especially, animated ones, have to be all happy, happy, joy, joy, but I was like, oh, I feel sad for adults now, I guess, and I don't want to be constrained by what this film thinks like adulthood and maturity and post-puberty might have to be. It tries to find a balance, but anyway, is this a perfectly fine experience at the movies? Yes, absolutely. I wasn't upset by this film. I will note, I did not cry, which, aside from there's a handful of Pixar movies I have not cried at, but usually it's just waterworks for me. So the fact that I was not moved in that way was slightly surprising for me. I think of Bing Bong and I get misty-eyed. So I'm not saying this is a bad or a good thing. I am just noting that I, again, was expecting to bawl my eyes out and brought tissues and then didn't have to use them, which is fine. But I think when the first one can move me so greatly and then this one doesn't quite hit that mark, it's like, okay, yeah. Did we need the sequel? Probably not. Am I angry they made it? No, because you shouldn't be angry about this type of thing. There are sequels. I talked about something like Furiosa, where I was like, oh, it almost detracted a little bit from my love of the first one, but this is not that. If you have kids, I think they will have a good time at it. There will be plenty of jokes for you. If you are an adult who's just a fan of animation and Pixar and etc., still go see this movie. I'm not saying don't go see this movie. I am just saying temper your expectations. And part of this is just a credit to the thing that this is built upon, in that, it's really hard to capture that lightning in a bottle. And Inside Out, the original, was such a brilliant film. And this one is a good film, So with that being said, I'm still going to give this a 4 out of 5. I know folks worked really hard on it. I think the animation is clever. There's some stylistic things I was like, oh, I'm glad they're continuing to kind of incorporate other styles. And there are some very funny things that play upon the style, but the voices are good. It just isn't quite as emotional a journey, in spite of there being more emotions packed in. So still a 4 out of 5 for me. The next film I have is called Ultraman Rising, and this is out on Netflix, and this is based on the character of Ultraman, which I will acknowledge I was vaguely familiar with, but I'm not like the biggest aficionado for. So, I can't speak to, if you are the Ultraman fan, how this will kind of scratch the itch for you. But as somebody who is new to this, I think it did a pretty decent job of establishing this character of Ultraman, who is basically kind of a regular dude who then, uses this power and becomes this giant kind of, I don't even know how many feet tall, but many stories tall hero who defends Japan from kaiju. And the idea behind Ultraman Rising is, what happens if you accidentally adopt, I don't know, a baby kaiju. And it centers around this character called Ken Sato, who's voiced by Christopher Sean, who is a baseball star who's moved back to Japan at the behest of his parents and has taken on the mantle of Ultraman, and then is forced to take on the mantle of parenthood. Now, this movie is 2 hours long, which I think is my biggest note about it, is that it does run a little bit long, but I had a very enjoyable time watching it. I think the animation style, talking further about that, is very cool. It's very comic booky at times. It's very action-packed superhero. They made a very cute baby kaiju, and kaiju are not something I necessarily think of as cute. You can definitely feel the, I think that, what did I hear once? Toddlers are basically just drunk adults, but smaller. You definitely get to feel that. It's very funny. I do not have children, but I think somebody with children especially will find the baby kaiju's behavior particularly evocative. It also has Gere Watanabe, Tamlin Tomita, Keone Young, and I really like about this that it's about family. And yes, it is a little on the nose about the family part of it, but just as an Asian person who has to deal with their parents and expectations and, the ways we communicate with each other, I thought it did a really nice job of capturing that. It's directed by Shannon Tyndall and John Aoshima, and I think they did a nice job of finding the balance of the humor, but also the emotion of it. And I don't think I can compare it to Inside Out 2 because they're just such different films, but as far as kind of hero films go, because this is effectively a superhero film, right? It is following along the format that has been laid out, and also kind of a kaiju-esque form. This was a really pleasant surprise, right? This was, I think, using the tropes of the genres that it kind of falls into, but also adding something different to them with the whole family aspect. Like I said, I think it went on a little bit long. I can tell they had fun making this film, and they're like, oh, well, what if we put this part in? What if we put this part in? What if we put this part in? So in that sense, if you are like a particularly younger audience, it might be, you might break up your viewings. But if you are a fan of Ultraman, I do think it is made with such love and reverence for it that, again, I can't speak to it exactly, but I get the sense based on talking to my peers and talking to the folks involved that, yes, you will love it. I think if you know nothing about it, you're also going to be welcomed into the world, which is the key for me with a franchise like this, right? Like, do I have to have seen 20 movies to understand this? Do I have to have seen prequels? Do I have to whatever? No, you can just slip right into this film. I think if you have parents and have a complicated relationship with your parents at all, this movie's definitely going to hit you in some feels. So I am also going to give this a 4 out of 5.